I'm listening with great interest as the different countries and different states make their decisions about what is next in all of this. And with a pretty international family, with my sister who in normal times lives in Hong Kong, and with, of course, my mother and my extended family living in London, just paying very close attention to, and it changes on a daily basis, like what is going to happen? Green passports. If you are fully vaccinated, then you can do this. You have to have like negative tests before you travel, and then another negative test as soon as you arrive. All of these different ways in which countries are going to be regulating this kind of reintegration into quote unquote normal life. The most extreme, actually, my sister, who, as I said, normally lives in Hong Kong, and she's been in England for the whole period, really. Right now, if she went back to Hong Kong, they've only just opened up direct flights from London to Hong Kong. She would actually have to spend 3 weeks in a hotel, and that is at her own expense, and not be able to even open the windows or leave the room of a hotel and have food delivered to the room. And so there are kind of extremes about this. And I've just been thinking about it. Partly, of course, I've been thinking about for my own personal, like having not seen any of my family for so long. I'm thinking about it as so many of us are, about how I'm going to be able to travel and see family again, and looking likely that I'm going to be going to England at the end of May after Shavuot. But I'm also thinking about it with such fascination about what we as a culture, what we as a civilization are doing as we prepare for this shift back, and knowing that in a sense nothing is ever going to be normal again, I don't think. But I think there is so much that we can learn from these extraordinary parshiot, which are very difficult. You know, I was remembering actually. I was remembering the Weissman family, who now live in Israel. I don't know if they're going to be coming back to Boulder, but I remember when Izzy had her bat mitzvah, and she had these parshiot. And she, you know, you imagine like talking to a 12-year-old girl about like all the things that can go wrong with your body. And we think there's something so vulnerable about it, something so vulnerable about it. We recognize, and as we age, of course, we recognize that more and more things can go wrong with our bodies, and that, you know, that's part of the grueling realities of aging, just the ways in which our bodies change, and our bodies do things that we don't really want them to be doing, and they release things that we don't really want them to be releasing. And all of these things that are actually discussed in these two parshiot are really about the fragility, in a sense, of the human body, and the great pain that happens around illness, around disease. But as I said earlier, there is also just this fascinating conjunction in the way the Torah understands wellness and illness as being this phenomenally connected relationship between the mind and the body and the spirit, so to speak. There's a very holistic sense to it. I was really struck as I was listening to Larry read that last Torah reading, that the Hebrew word shemen, which means oil, which came up many, many times, when it's in its pausal form, meaning when it's at the end of a verse, it's actually shaman. And I've been thinking about shamans, because like in a sense that the role that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, played, he was like a shaman. He was like a shaman in that there was this incredible ritual that went into the process of bringing people back inside when they've been outside for so long. In some cases, this quarantine, which is really what it is, was really for quite a long period of time. And on a weekly basis, every 7 days, the Kohen would check and look at the symptoms and the way they were being manifest on the person, on the Metzora, on the person who was afflicted with this sarat, which, as I said earlier, is definitely not leprosy. It's some unknown affliction that breaks out in the body in these strange ways. But the Kohen would check regularly, the priest, not the doctor. The leader of all of the ritual for the community would be the person who was checking out what was going on, and when it was time to reintegrate the person back into the camp. And so I wanted to just look a little bit at the moment right before that person goes into isolation and the moment when they come out of isolation, and the way the Torah describes them. We read both of them. We read them at the end of chapter 13 and the beginning of chapter 14. It's both the isolation and the reintegration. And I think there's a lot that we can learn. The first thing is this whole shaming that seems to be happening. It seems to be that there's a public shaming that goes on because this person is ripping their clothes, they're degrading themselves in a certain way. Once they've been really kind of diagnosed, that when the Kohen says, yes, you have tzara'at, they tear their clothing, they go out, they cover interestingly, their upper lip, as I said before, and then they go out and they call out publicly, tamei, 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 like basically saying, I am impure, I am impure. Which is just such an act of public humiliation, I think. And Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, and I made a commitment to Gali that I would always mention Jonathan Sacks every week. He in one of his essays on this week's Parshat, he talks about the difference between cultures that are about shame and cultures that are about guilt. And he says that fundamentally, Judaism is not a shame culture. It's a guilt culture. What's the difference? According to him, he says the difference is that a guilt culture is about internal. It's about recognizing within ourselves what we've done and how we could do better. And the rituals are about how we confront our own inner reality, how we confront our relationship with God. But a shame culture is about the publicness, about the sense of like, I am saying to my community that I've done these things. And mostly he says, we can argue about it if you like, but he claims that there are very, very few cases where Judaism puts shame over guilt. And this is one of them. This is one of them. Clearly, this is one of them, because this tamei in public. Now, there is a midrash that says that the reason is actually not about shame, but it's about the opposite. It's if the person, poor Nebuch, this person who's been diagnosed with tzara'at, is going out in public and saying tamei, it's actually going to instill compassion in the people who see and hear this person. And so actually it's about inviting the community in that kind of chesed way. I mentioned Karen Robinson being the chair of our chesed committee, this way that the community actually takes care of each other. So even though they can't physically be in touch, who knows, once this person is done this act of saying tamei, I'm impure, they then go out for this period of time into their isolation and their quarantine outside the camp. And who knows, maybe there was a sort of chesed committee back then where once people knew that someone was outside the camp, they were arranging like meals. They were maybe, I don't think meal train existed back then, but maybe there was just a way in which a community would come together. That's possible. I don't know like what it means, but I do. What Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says about it, why is it shaming? Because there is this unanimous opinion of, as I've already mentioned, that the cause is what's important, not the manifestation and the illness. And there's also this sense that tzara'at is not a contagious disease. The quarantine is not because of fear of contagion. It only goes into the sphere of the person who's afflicted. And as we've said, it can go in the walls of their house, it can go into their clothes, and it can manifest on their skin. But all of those manifestations, according to our tradition, come from what this person has done, and it is most commonly understood to be lashon hara, which is speaking badly about other people. Not necessarily lying, by the way. Lashon hara is not about telling things that aren't true. Lashon hara is just about anything that could have a negative effect on somebody. And so what Rabbi Sacks says is that that's what's contagious. Lashon hara is contagious. The disease itself is not contagious, but if the person stays within the camp until they are completely purified from what they have done and what they've been saying about another person or about other people, they have to have this time out in order to really do this sort of inner work of teshuvah, so that when they come back into the camp, they're no longer sort of putting this negative energy into the world of slander and of evil speech. That's his opinion. I think it's very compelling, and this idea that sometimes public shame is very powerful. I mean, what he says in this essay, he talks about how social media is like intense in its public shaming. He opens the essay by telling this story about this woman who was boarding a plane to actually to go to, I don't remember which country, but an African country. And as she got on the plane, she sent out a tweet on her phone, which said something like, "I'm on my way to Africa. I hope I don't get AIDS." By the time she landed, there were millions, literally, of retweets, and she'd become a pariah and had to like leave her job. And she was totally shamed because of it was a very, very inappropriate and racist comment that she made. But the power of social media to take a comment, and no one knows the intention of her comment. In the moment, it was, I'm sure, a very, very bad joke, but it destroyed this woman's reputation. And that's the sort of the effect of, in our culture, we have a big public shaming culture, but going back to the Torah, the world of the Torah is much, much, much more about this inner world of guilt and transformation and coming back in. And so that's part of it, is this quarantine. Like, obviously, we've all experienced, to different levels and different degrees, we've all felt like we've been in this collective quarantine. I mean, quarantine is an interesting word. It's actually, the root of it is that it was a 40-day period. That's where the etymology of quarantine is about 40, right? So this idea that there was a 40-day period, which was considered to be enough of a period to, if you were totally taken out from the rest of society, whatever you had was going to be safe when you came back into society. But of course, with COVID, we know that it's been very, as I said at the beginning, it's like, it's so random. Like, every country, every state is making up the rules for quarantine. Like, do we do 2 weeks? Do we do 5 days? Do we do 7 days? Do we do 10 days? Like, how do we do this? We don't know, because there is so much about the science of this. Last time we had people in here, like when we were doing some of the bar and bar mitzvahs, and the last time Gali was here was for Moshe's bar mitzvah, I think, the last time you were live in the room, right? But back then we were like so carefully wiping down the handles of the Torah, wiping down the doors of the ark every time we touch, and now we know that the science is kind of saying, as long as we are still wearing the masks and as long as we're keeping our hands clean, the surfaces thing is not such a big deal. And so the kind of sense of how this disease kind of spreads changes a little bit as the science and the understanding of it changes. And then if we look at the causes of it, I mean, by no means am I going to in any way suggest that anybody who got COVID was because of some internal sin that they did. God forbid. That's absolutely not true. We know this is a pandemic. This is a virus. We still don't really, there's a lot of mystery around the origin. Was it a bat? Was it a snake? Was it a fish? I don't know. But it's like there was some kind of unknown origin from something. The effects of crazy industrialized food systems, it seems, and mass populations is ultimately what caused this. I mean, yes, it is traced to Wuhan, China, but at this point, to try and trace the cause and to try and understand the cause, yes, we need to understand it scientifically to avoid its spread. So in some senses, it's very, very, very different to talking about Sara'at, but I think there are lessons that we learn. There are lessons that we learn about what it means to go into isolation, because really, that period of isolation or quarantine that the person with Sara'at had to undergo was really about a process of transformation and integration and purification. And that's what happens when they come back out into society. So then we read, when that person is ready to come back into the community, it is highly ritualized. And I've been thinking, like, what would it mean for us to create rituals about how we reintegrate into community and into society? And perhaps there's something we can learn from these rituals and perhaps not, but let's just quickly go over what they are. So they come, when the priest defines that the time is right for this person to come back into the camp, back into the machaneh, back into community, the person comes in and then there are these two live birds, right? And we heard the chattering of birds earlier. Two live birds, a branch of cedar and a branch of hyssop, right? Erez and Ezov. And then there is this shani tola'at, which is some kind of crimson thread. So those are the ingredients of the ritual. Very, very powerful ingredients. And as I said, that that word I kept hearing Larry read, shaman. I feel like, wow, the Kohen is like a shaman in an ancient ritualistic world, taking things from the earth, taking things from nature, and using them for this reintegration and transformation kind of period. So one of the birds is slaughtered, and it is slaughtered above a clay vessel that has mayim chaim in it, that has living water in it, which means water that has coming from a natural source, like a mikveh. And as it's slaughtered, the blood drips into the bowl of the mayim chaim, and then all of the blood goes into that, is mixed with that water. And then the Kohen takes the live bird and the bundle of hyssop and cedar and the scarlet crimson, dips it in the blood. And then the blood is kind of put onto very interesting places: the head, the ear, the right thumb, and the big toe of the right foot. And there's commentaries that I've read about this that are about saying, like, if there is going to be a reintegration into the community, every part of this person's being has to be brought into a new kind of awareness, right? Their mind, their heart, their spirit, their actions, through their hands, through their feet, like how they walk in the world, how they're going to re-enter steps walking into the world, like in a different way. And blood is placed on all of those things, and it's also placed onto the altar, onto the mizbeach, and which is about the spiritual relationship. So there's every level of relationship, spiritual, intellectual, and physical, with hands and feet, and like how we filter information through our ears also seems to be very significant. So there's a lot of power in that ritual. I'm not, of course, suggesting that we start messing with slaughtering birds, but maybe there are ways in which we can reintegrate using ritual to do it. I mean, it's something I don't have the answer, but I'm asking the question of how we as a community, how we as a Bonai Shalom community, how we as a wider Jewish community, how we as a city, a state, a world can do this. I mean, it's interesting what Maddie said about the sort of saging, in shamanic rituals, when you burn sage, it's about purification and cleansing. Okay, so if you take these elemental, water, blood, bird, two different types of branch, and this crimson thread, which is the most mysterious of all of them. I'm not really sure where that fits into it all, but it's some sources say it was white and then it turns red from the blood. So it wasn't actually in its inception crimson, whatever. But there are ways, I think, that we could create ritual to bring us back into community. The birds, according to the Midrash, and I'm sure you've heard this, and I think I alluded to it earlier, the idea, if the primary cause understood by the rabbis for this illness is indeed about speech, about Lashon Hara, there's this idea that birds are constantly chattering. And so we use something that in nature is chattering as a sort of almost like a homeopathic remedy to our own chattering, and just as a way to silence us, which, I don't know, I'm as someone who kind of loves birds in their natural habitat and does not find their chatter to be anything other than beautiful song. I find that interpretation a little harsh. Rabbi Shefa Gold talks about this in such a powerful way. She says that the blessing of Metzora comes to us as the force of reintegration symbolized by the priest, as it reaches out to you in your place of alienation, recognizes your transformation, and brings you back to the community. In the ritual of reentry, two birds are brought. One is killed to symbolize the old self that has died, and one is set free in the open country to express the reborn self, flying free into an expanded life. I find that very powerful because there is, I think, every single one of us, there's pieces of us that have died during this pandemic. There are pieces of us that will never be the same again. There are pieces of us that we won't ever recognize again to be what we knew before. It's very, very hard for me to imagine, as much as we might want it and crave it even, it's very hard for me to imagine that we're just going to come back and say, well, that happened, now we're back to life, you know. For some people it might be. For me, it's not going to be, and I suspect for most of us it's not going to be, and I hope it's not going to be, because I think the implication of Sheffer Gold's piece there is that, you know, if this has happened to our world and we haven't learned some really important lessons from it, then that's really, really a dangerous thing, right? We can't just, like, you know, bear it while it's happening and then just do everything we can to get back into life. These things happen. Again, I'm not looking for spiritual causes for it or even the physical cause of it. But once something happens, we have the capacity and the possibility to actually look as a community, as individuals, as families, as what are the lessons that we've learned? And how do we want to bring those lessons forward into the new unfolding of life? And what rituals might we include in that? Like, how might we symbolically ritualize the fact that there are pieces of ourselves that have died? How might we ritualize coming back into a sense of freedom and possibility, but in a different way? How might we ritualize our transformation? How might we ritualize the lessons that we've learned and the ways in which there's part of us, like a snake that has shed old skins, and that we are coming together in a new way? So these are questions. Like I said, I don't have answers, but I think it's really important to ask the question. And they'll be different for each of us. But as you know, as we, like we said, one of a Jewish ritual, of course, is a Shehechianu, which we said like right before the Torah service, because this is the first time for a long time that we've had more than 1 million of people in the physical space. So we say, Shehechianu, who has kept us alive, V'kiyimanu, and has sustained us, V'higianu lazman hazeh, and has brought us to be in this moment together. And as we think about all of the new moments that we're going to be having, like for some of us, you know, have not yet eaten in a restaurant. So when the first time we eat in a restaurant after more than a year, how do we mark that? Do we just like, oh, can I see the menu? Oh yes, I'll have the. No, I mean, these are moments that we're going back as different people. So all of the, you know, how do we recognize the first time we're in someone else's house? If those of us who've not been in other people's houses, how do we mark those spaces and those coming together? How do we, and I think this is the biggest one for many of us, like I'm thinking about this, like having only seen members of my family on a computer screen for so long, how do I mark that when I actually see my mother for the first time in almost 2 years? How am I going to recognize her? Are we going to hug each other? I don't know, you know, my sister, my nephew, my cousins' kids who have grown up a lot since I was last there. You know, how do we create ritual around that? Or do we just try and go back to normal? I don't think so. Putting a lot of questions out there and not many answers, but I do think, as always, you know, the Torah is a mirror for us of life, and the fact that these parshas, even though they're hard and challenging in lots of ways, the fact that these are the sections of Torah that we are reading on this first Shabbat, that we have people here live, I think enables us to ask a lot of these questions and to think about what it has meant to be isolated and in quarantine, and what it's going to mean to come back into the machaneh, back into the camp. One of the things about the shaming that I'm very, very conscious of in all of this is like, we are so divided, obviously, in so many different ways as a nation. It's like, although I understand and I feel very grateful that I'm now like 5 weeks out from my second vaccine, I think if we as a community and if we as society start to create a stigma around the people who are choosing not to be vaccinated, that is like someone saying, tameh, tameh. It's like, yes, we as a community are absolutely, we're not like checking people's vaccination records at the door. We are taking temperatures, and we are insisting that people continue to wear masks. But you know, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I really understand the arguments and the rights of people who are to not receive the vaccination. And I think that can be part of that shaming culture. If those of us who have chosen to be vaccinated start sort of creating second-class citizens out of the people who haven't, I think that's really, that's dangerous. And I don't want to be part of a community that does that. I understand the fears around it. I understand the whole herd immunity thing. I understand the countries that are not going to let people in unless they have a vaccination record. But I just think that we have to be very cautious about how we do that, how we recognize the people's rights to choose. I mean, misinformation is something else. The crazy conspiracy theories about vaccinations, that's something I don't even want to go there. But I think there are, some people have legitimate reasons for choosing not to be vaccinated, and we have to honor that. Perhaps we have to have honest conversations, but we can't close people out of our community because they're making a different choice to us, because that's part of this reintegration. We're coming back together as a community with caution, with optimism as well as caution, but how do we do this in a way that respects all of the individuals within community and within society? Big, big questions. Enough questions. I'm sorry I don't have the answers, but as I've said so many times, to me, the power of religion is not about the answers. It's about being able to ask the questions and to discover the answers together, and even sometimes acknowledging that there are no answers. But I look forward to coming more and more together, and I look forward to us being able to maybe talk together. Some of the people here who've been so involved in this process, it's just so amazing just seeing Stacy and Michelle, our executive director and our board president, who've just been so much a part of every single decision that we've made along the way. And maybe the three of us can talk about like how we ritualize the coming back, how we make it meaningful and significant, as well as safe and joyful as we come back together. So with that, I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. I hope that we will be together soon, and we will move on and draw our service to a conclusion now. Shabbat Shalom.